Hi, everyone. Since we didn't finish talking about assessment during our last class, I wanted to record a quick video just talking through some of the key concepts that I was hoping that you could come away with after reading and engaging with some of the content around assessment. And a lot of what you included in your reflections was already demonstrating kind of your critical understanding around assessments for multilingual learners and the ways that assessments are used for multilingual learners, thinking about how some assessments may not be as reliable or valid as we might imagine when we're using them with MLLs. So a few things that I wanted to share. I've got a few slides to walk you through. The first is I wanted to begin with the 2022 RICAS data. So this is the Rhode Island Comprehensive Assessment data, and it's measuring students' progress in math and language arts. And I recently attended a presentation where they were sharing this data, and you see similar data all over the country when we're talking about MLLs. You see third grade MLLs not meeting expectations, especially when compared to their non-MLL peers in math and language arts. And then the same thing in eighth grade, we see that it's an even lower number of MLLs who are meeting expectations in those areas. The problem with this way of thinking about MLL achievement is that by definition, a multilingual learner is a student who is still acquiring grade level academic English. As we've talked about in this class, as soon as a student no longer is in that process, as soon as they've met a certain criteria for language proficiency, they are no longer an MLL. So you will always have MLLs underperforming on these types of assessments because by definition, that is a student who is still developing English. So that's one problem with some of the ways that we talk about assessments and this kind of continued narrative of underperforming. It's also challenging. In the presentation I attended with this data, they were comparing the third grade data to the eighth grade data. Again, the problem here is that this subgroup has changed. A student who's identified as an MLL in eighth grade might not have been an MLL in third grade. They might not have been in the United States at that point, right? They might have immigrated in seventh grade or sixth grade. So we can't compare these two groups as if they were the same students. I imagine many students in third grade who are multilingual learners by eighth grade are no longer MLLs, right? So that's one critical lens that I hope you have when you're thinking about and having conversations about data with future colleagues if you plan to work in education. So a more expansive way to think about this data is to also include recently exited students. So now, based on federal law, thanks to the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, that was passed on the Obama administration, we also need to track students who no longer are MLLs, but were, right, at least for 2 years. And so here you can see when we look across this data, students identified as MLLs, non-MLLs, and recently exited. In third grade, the recently exited students are actually outperforming non-MLLs, which is really interesting data, and shows that this group is actually performing really well. They're outperforming, and some of that is because these students, some of them have been in bilingual programs, and we know how that it supports their learning, having a base in their first language that they're then building upon as they're learning a new language, as they're learning English. But this is a really important data point, right? Now we can see, wow, so students are successful, as they continue to move. Obviously, there's still only 55% and 61% who are meeting expectations. So, there's obviously work to be done, but this is a much more holistic picture of how MLLs are performing in the state. In eighth grade, we don't see those same kind of gigantic gains, and we don't see recently exited MLLs outperforming non-MLLs. But again, we do see that they're performing at higher levels than MLLs. So it's an important part of the picture, right, when we're thinking about student performance and how we're interpreting data. All right, so I wanted to give you that example as you continue to think about other challenges or problems regarding assessment and MLLs. I'm not going to get into all the details here. We're going to talk about it more in class, but you've read about a lot of different challenges and things that teachers and administrators and anybody who works with MLLs and does assessment needs to consider around kind of some bias around the way we're using the data, and just being really thoughtful and careful in how we make claims about the performance of multilingual learners. Because these the ways that we're interpreting student data and the types of assessments that we're getting to show student learning as evidence of learning do have real life consequences. A recent article in Language Magazine, you can see the magazine there, talked about one of the challenges that teachers are facing as we move towards more reliance on testing and reading for phonics and fluency. So while we know reading is a more holistic skill, right? We know it's complex and involves a lot of moving pieces. And for MLLs, we know that background knowledge matters, vocabulary knowledge, oral language proficiency matters. Oftentimes when we think about reading proficiency or reading success, we look just at phonics and fluency. And as you can see in this article, I've bolded a few items here, but that oftentimes now passing some of these phonics tests that were designed for monolingual English speakers, has become a prerequisite for students to be able to do other types of more rigorous and more meaningful reading related activities. And if they don't pass the test, then they're stuck in this isolated phonics instruction that, again, the instruction and the assessment were both designed for monolingual English speakers. So these tests matter, right? Students in some states are held back if they don't pass a certain standardized test. So when we think about advocacy, it's important that we think about our role in kind of pushing back against these single measures of student learning, finding out if the assessments were even designed with multilingual learners in mind. Many reading assessments were not. And so recognizing that we're missing a lot if we don't think about students' holistic repertoire, if we don't look at other indicators of their performance beyond just what they can do on a narrow assessment in a language that they're still learning how to speak and read and write and listen in. And here's just one more example from a reading stance. So one assessment that's commonly used to as a diagnostic tool for evaluating the student's ability to decode, or their ability to match a sound to a symbol. So looking at the letter B and being able to identify that letter sounds like B, is a nonsense word assessment. So nonsense words are letter sequences that follow regular phonetic rules for the language that you're assessing them in, and they're pronounceable, but they have no meaning. So in English, some nonsense words might be buff, zim, and chog. Chog. Struggling with the nonsense words too. Now, a Spanish-speaking student, a Spanish-speaking MLL, might not decode these words, which are based on phonetic patterns in English, in the same way as a native English speaker that is decoding them, right? So they might, instead of saying zim, they might say zim, because the I in Spanish, it makes a long I sound, right? So instead of zim, like Tim or Jim in English, they would probably read that as Zim if they're drawing upon their Spanish phonetic knowledge. Or for chog, which is based on the English word family of og, so jog, fog, bog. They might say chog, right? Because the O in Spanish is long, again. So a teacher who doesn't know Spanish might identify these as errors, might say the student does not know how to properly decode these sounds, right? But I would ask, is this evidence of a student's inability to decode or our inability to understand this exercise, considering the student's holistic multilingual repertoire? And this is just one example of a diagnostic tool that's often used to say that a student, is failing at reading, doesn't have some essential reading skills, needs some additional targeted phonics supports. When in reality, what the student might need is just broader, more contrastive analysis, broader exposure to a wide variety of texts, opportunities to read in meaningful ways. Yeah, phonics support might still be useful, but we're not diagnosing correctly if we're not considering their full repertoire, right? Okay, so some directions forward that the chapter talked about are performance-based assessments. So having students do something to show their learning as opposed to just, completing a test. Translanguaging assessments, so opportunities where students can draw upon their full linguistic repertoire to show what they know. So that might take the form of, writing something bilingually, a bilingual product. It might involve them being able to read something in English, but talk about it in Spanish, or vice versa, read a text in Spanish and talk about it in English. So different ways that we're providing students with opportunities to leverage everything they know. Multiple modes for showing what they can do again. So instead of just having it be an essay, are there other ways the student could show me what they understand from this text, what they can do if we're looking at a specific skill? And then also always remembering that it matters if the people interpreting those assessments know the student's home language, or at least know something about their home language. We know that there are over 90 home languages spoken by MLLs in the state. The expectation is not that every teacher needs to learn 90 languages, but I think every teacher should at least know something about Spanish because it's the largest home language of our MLLs, and should learn something about the students' home languages in the room, right? So the students in your room, the languages they speak, know something about them so that when you're interpreting assessments, you can bring those lenses to your interpretation. All right. So I'm going to pause the video here and I'll include the assessment analysis in a separate video. But those are just a few things that I want you to think about as you're reflecting upon how assessments are used, what we know about assessments and MLLs, and some of the ways that you might consider bringing this knowledge back into a classroom if you're teaching, or in an advocacy role, in whatever pathway you are taking after this class. All right, that's it for now. Thanks.